So we're going to have a conversation now about what it means to be black in 2018. This is one of the hardest topics to talk about, but it's also a topic that we've got to discuss. So Gavin, why don't you tell us a little bit about where you come from, where you're working, and what's happening?
Sure, happy to. So Gavin Lewis, I work at Vanguard Asset Management in the UK. I grew up in a single parent family on a council estate, managed to somehow stumble into university, did very well academically, and I found myself in this position and agree with DAWID that now's the time to start talking about the subjects.
Fabulous, we're going to hear more about that. Chi-chi, tell us a little bit about your story.
Well, I grew up in a completely different area to Gavin, in that I grew up in Kent, near Canterbury, and we were the only black family in the region. And having a black father, a white mother, I had two parents from opposite cultural ethnicities, and who stayed together throughout their entire lives, married life, until death parted them. And we were always very in touch with our roots, especially our African roots, because we would travel to Nigeria, to Dad's village, but we never travelled to Ireland because my mother was rejected from her family when she married my dad. So, and I never had any friends or teachers of colour. So my world was a very white world, and even though I had a black dad and mixed race siblings like myself, and then in my last year at school, when I went into classical music as my profession, then the world just continued being white. And so that's what I've navigated for the last 40 years.
Yeah, fabulous. We're really going to get into that as well. Justin, tell us a bit about your story.
Justin Onuekwusi, I am head of retail multi-asset funds at Elgin, a fund manager working in the investment team. So single parent family, grew up with my mum and my brother. Managed to do well at school, similar to Gavin, did a numeric degree at university, so Warwick University, and I suppose I stumbled in some way into the city as an actuary.
Let's just get into this whole conversation around talking about black. I mean, look at us, four of us, people of colour, black people sitting around, having a conversation, maybe for the first time. I don't think I've ever seen a conversation like this, right?
I think it is difficult, and I think it's probably less difficult than it was, because we have people like us to push the conversation, but that's very different to suggesting that it's easy. I think my thoughts are that, firstly, when it comes to, I guess, issues of social constructs, there are certain things that, as a nation, which is a very, very white nation, the UK is, that we're comfortable talking about, and that may be things such as gender, perhaps class, sexual orientation, but there are certain things which we just haven't raised as a subject, what we don't have as a UK as a social conscious about. And I would say perhaps religion is one of those, and race is the next one. In our industry, there is a lack of representation of people of colour. So if we don't raise a subject, then the issue is not going to raise itself.
Yeah.
And I just think it's out of people's comfort zones.
Chi-chi, you agree with that? Why don't you
I do. I'm really excited now because we are talking about it. It's a question of not wanting to start a conversation. Certainly in my experience, having been in the classical industry, where I was aware, of course I was aware, that I was the only person of colour in any orchestra or
literally
ensemble.
The only person.
Literally the only. I could count on the fingers of one hand how many people of colour I'd ever worked with in England, and 3 of them were opera singers, and one was a viola player in Scotland, and then I was the other one. So you can't really make an orchestra with 2 instruments. So it was a question of going out and finding, and literally the more I searched, because up until then, when this conversation did arise about why weren't there more people like me, people would say straight into my face, but it's not really your sort of music, is it? Or, well, you're not really kitted up for this. You have to be very good.
People actually say that?
people say that to me.
It's extraordinary. I mean, Justin, what's it like in your world? Because I think we saw a survey recently. There are 12 you're a portfolio manager, manage assets. I mean, there are 12 out of thousands, right?
So I think it is a difficult conversation to have, and I think the reason why I think for black people is that, particularly in our industry, it's like, well, the whole time you realise that you're an outlier almost, that you look differently from everybody else, you probably sound different from everybody else. You try to fit in, and by trying to fit in, you try and avoid talking about it.
Yep.
And then at the same time, then the non-black people, or the non-ethnic people, or the majority, don't talk about it either. They want to be colourblind. They want to say that actually it doesn't have any influence on any decisions, and so on and so forth. So for almost from both sides, it's actually a very difficult conversation to have. But I do think we have turned a corner. And now that we have more senior people in the industry, in roles, who are more willing to engage with senior management about the challenges, I think now it's just a much better time, and actually a better platform to have that discussion.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we talk about financial services, which is our industry, but actually this is everywhere, right? It's in the arts, it's in the sciences, it's in medicine, it's in law. It just doesn't matter where you look. There is an issue with underrepresentation of the black community. Yeah. Do you think our institutions are inherently racist? Let's just ask the big question. Or do you think is that going too far?
So I actually think racist is a very strong word. But I think when you look at our institutions, you do see racial biases, whether it's the police force with stop and search. We know it disproportionately affects black people. Whether it's schools, where if you look at the national curriculum, you look at things like history. Really how are ethnic minorities really represented in the history books? Whether it's when people apply for jobs, right? When people do CVs and so on and so forth. If you have an ethnically sounding name, we know that you've got a less probability of getting a role. So I think racist is a very strong word, and it's
okay. But what word would you use then?
So I think overt racism against kind of biases. There's a grey area in the middle.
So biases, you think, no doubt about it. Overt racism, the way we kind of.
I think we're scared of using that word because we've been trained that it's a bad word. Yeah. But let's call it out for what it is. That's what's going on. Yesterday, I was so distressed hearing there was a news discussion about the imbalance of arrests still going on with young black boys. It's gone up actually, being stopped and searched for drugs. And then of course that just goes on to weapons and things like that. And when you think that there's only one person of ethnicity in a senior role in the police force, I think, that's the issue. And
is it just in the police then, do you think, or do you think this is a wider?
I think it's it's definitely a wider thing. And my experience with being invited to do certain things with the Chineke Orchestra now
is the orchestra you set up?
Yes, it's the orchestra that I've set up. We get invited to do things literally every day things are happening, but major things like BBC productions and things like that. I hear about launches happening, and then we're not invited until at the very last minute they realise, oh my goodness, we're not representing we better call Chi-chi, and so we get called in at very short notice, and that means we have less time to prepare, which is setting us up possibly to not do such a great job, to have 1 month's notice rather than 6 months' notice.
And what do you put that down to? If we really dig into it, what is the mindset that is driving these huge institutions, either it's the police or it's the media or the arts? What do you think it is?
I think people, I think it's human nature to think of your own species first. I think people are afraid even now to say, oh, I must go and ask a black person to do something in case they are being looked upon as ticking a box and being tokenistic. And there's all these kind of fears popping around at the moment. And rather than just go ahead and book somebody outside your normal remit and deal with the problem afterwards.
Yeah, well, Gavin, you've made it through the system. You're a senior guy in your organisation. What do you think? Do you think organisations are racist? Do you think there's unconscious bias? I mean, what's been your experience? What do you make of it now that you're 15 years in the industry?
So I think for me to subscribe to the view that there is institutional racism, so let's take our industry as a start. I think
Financial services.
Financial services, yeah. So I would have to see purposeful structural barriers that prohibit the advancement of black people, and those would have to be hard coded into those institutions. And honestly, I don't see that. What I do see, however, is the human element and the behavioural, and I use Justin's term, biases. Now, there's an argument to ask, well, what are organisations made of? Are they made of rules and procedures, or are they made of human decisions? But I don't, in my experience, there wasn't anything physical stopping me from progressing. The progression really stemmed from, or the difficulty in progressing, and I see this in young people that I mentor, it's cultural differences, it's unconscious bias, it's psychological, it's a psychology of the people that you're reporting into and the reportees themselves. So a great example would be, we see young black people enter financial services, and if you look at the numbers, they're represented greater at the entry levels and support positions. But why don't they progress?
Why don't they make it up?
It plays out by struggling at the interview stage. So my experience was applying to graduate schemes, doing very well in the psychometric tests, the CV, the online stuff, the group stuff when you have to politic with other people. And, I shone. When it came to the interview, the questions were such, well, what did you do during summer? Well, I worked at a well-known supermarket. Because I had to pay the bills, and to give that job up would have been like giving up a lifeline. But I didn't go to Rwanda and build a school. I just because I couldn't try to deal with the problems in front of me, let alone problems 20,000 miles away. But then that counted against me. That's a challenge that you have coming into the industry. On the other side of it, and here's where I think that we don't have these physical barriers, but we have people's personal views and biases, is the way that those interviewees were tuned into thinking about me was not, what's wrong with this guy, he has no aspirations. It should have been, wow, this guy put himself through university and I want that guy in my team. Yes. Those are the barriers. Is that racism? I don't think so.
Well, Chi-chi thinks you've got to call it out for what it is. So it's an interesting, but the effect is the same because you don't get through the system.
The outcome. I
mean, Justin, what do
you... avoiding using the word racism, it's seeing people coming into your industry with the same set of values and experiences as yourself. And all of the people interviewing you have done the outreach things in Rwanda and various places. They haven't worked in that well-known, supermarket. And so they think, well, how they don't see you as one of them. And so...
Well, let me give you my contrast. So it depends on what your benchmark is, right? So my benchmark for racism, so I grew up, very, very different background to Chi-chi, as we've discussed. So very, very black area, poor schools. My mum sent me out of the borough into another borough, into a very, very white school, because she made the assumption that those schools would be better. But what she didn't count on is sending me out of Tottenham and into Enfield, and then me encountering overt racism on a daily basis. And that's where that's my benchmark for racism, is when I hear the N-word and the school teachers. That for me is there's something hard coded into those institutions. So does that mean that other things are not on the spectrum? Maybe not, but that's kind of my benchmark for it. Yeah. The other example I'll give is, you mentioned the police force. So as a young kid growing up in Tottenham, experience racial profiling is to live and breathe that. That's when my view about this place is actually, they're not nearly. Yeah, and it's not just the fact that you're a black kid and you're being profiled, or a black person being profiled. It's the approach. So it's not we are stopping you because someone fits your description. There's almost an arrogance about the approach, and you belong down here and I'm up here. That's it's right. Those, that, yes. but maybe my benchmark is different. So
yeah, my family experienced all that. When we moved to Berkshire, we lived just outside Reading, and suddenly, we were in a much more diverse community, and so apart from me, I seem to be the only one that skipped it. All my siblings were being constantly stopped and searched. And so that's when we started becoming much more politicised, I suppose, or just aware of what really literally comes to your
Do you
front
think
door.
that's still happening in this? I mean, every time I got in my car, I got stopped by the cops every single time, without a doubt. And I had a Mozart clarinet concerto cassette that I would stick in and turn up the volume when they walked up. I just trying to reconstruct the whole narrative.
Diffuse the situation.
Yeah, as they arrived, I'd say, sorry, officer, that's what I'm telling you. Sorry, second movement, sorry. I got stopped like literally, hundreds of times. But you have a sense that we've moved on from that. So how do we now have a constructive conversation? Because one of the questions that I keep getting asked, and I guess you all do as well, is it's great that we're now living in an environment where we can actually talk about black and we can get out there and have this conversation. But people then say, but how do you have the conversation? Can you be sensitive and yet make the point? How can you call people out or call situations out without describing it as racist? How do you go there?
I think what I find difficult is, because I really want to talk about it, and I'm enjoying the opportunities now that I can to talk about it, but I don't want to always feel that we're on the defensive and sounding like we're always asking to be accepted, sort of thing. That's what I don't like.
Yeah.
And I want us all to be able to calmly rise above that with a smile and not feel that we're complaining.
Yeah, which feels like the way to go. But how do you? I mean, Justin, can you shed any light on how you do that?
Yeah, I think that it's very difficult, because I think that at junior levels, it's so hard for them to have the conversation without it being self-serving, and without being accused of using the race card, etc., etc. So I honestly think that by being relatively senior in an organisation now, where you kind of you have less fear almost, and you're willing to, and then you have conversations with the junior people within your organisation. You realise the challenges that they've gone through, and you actually say, actually, I recognise those challenges because I've been through exactly the same thing. So I actually think that the reason why we're having the conversation now is because that there's simply more senior black people within the industry, and speaking together, and not even in the industry, in general, and speaking together is just a lot more powerful than speaking alone.
And telling the stories right, I think I mean, we're wired for stories, right? Whenever you hear once upon a time, you're like, what happened next, right? And just hearing the story, what does it mean to be black in 2018, and trying to work your way up through an organization that has kinks in the hosepipe, as it were, that stop you making it, that's a hugely powerful thing.
We have to find the way through to happily change the perceptions. And when I look back to when I started school, I was in London. I was born in London, and a short spell, 2 years living in Nigeria, and then started my first primary school in Kentish Town. And I know now that I was the only black child in my year, but I was also the only child who could read fluently. And so I know for sure the teacher was not expecting that. And in fact, the only thing I remember about my first day at school was that, what's the matter with all these children? They can't read. It was our mother who kind of politicised us, actually, rather than Dad. And both of my parents, particularly my father, was very differential, and just always kowtowing to the rules. And on the occasions when he would be insulted in the street and called those horrible words, I would be 7 or 8, and we were walking through Canterbury or something, and then we would meet the occasional family that would be abusive to him, and I'd just get this extra little gentle squeeze on my hand. And as we grew up and had odd experiences like that, my father was so peaceful and very calm, and the worst thing I ever heard him say to anyone was when a white lady and her children were blocking our way, and she was screaming all these N words and W words into my dad's face, and he let her finish venting her spleen. And the worst thing I ever heard him say when she'd finished was, "I pity you and your children." And she just deflated immediately because he was so kind. And I know that sort of reaction from my father drove my brothers mad when they were becoming teenagers and experiencing things for real. They just wanted to beat the lights out of the people insulting their father, and it sort of affected, particularly my brothers, because Dad was so calm.
And how do we change the narrative, particularly within young black folk, black kids on the street who, are huge numbers of them are losing their way, kind of almost where you started, but now in their lives as well, right? How do we get into that community and say there's another way? Because part of it is looking at our organizations and saying we need to remove those biases and we need to change the mindset. But we also need to get into the community.
Yeah, we do, and it's something that I feel very, very strongly about because I was one of those kids, and you just have these points in life where you have to make a decision, and one decision, one moment in time,
you make a bad decision
can decide your whole life. And when you think about it in those terms, it's frightening because most people just don't make the right decision. Now, this is so complex, and if you look at it from the top down, firstly, those kids don't have enough role models. The only role models they have are sports people or people in entertainment. And those are really, really important role models. But suppose you're not a talented musician. Yeah. Suppose you just don't have. Well, then what option do you have? So how achievable is it to be the next AJ? Yeah, how achievable is it to be a successful musician? It's not for the majority of people. So we just lack those people who can go back into those communities and show them another way. We need people like us to do that. But then we also need to think about this from the bottom up, and whether we like it or not. And it may be a self-defense mechanism. It may be a result of socioeconomic deprivation. It may be a legacy of slavery, that the culture that we have in these communities.
That's several hundred years old. Do you think that's still playing out?
Well, what I think is that we have a mindset where that we've never broken free from.
The colonialism mindset?
Yeah, I do. I think we, as a people, we have a mindset, and that's not everybody. I mean, I have plenty of friends who come from very, very wealthy families and who are black, so this isn't across the
I don't think it's about wealth, though.
No, it's a mindset. No, and I agree with you, it's a mindset. And the mindset, I think, is, whether we realise it or not, is one of perhaps subservience and not empowering each other.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
You think that idea of?
Yeah, similar. I think as opposed to in America, my friends and colleagues that I've got to know in the last few years, and also just knowing about American stuff, they have a stronger network and they support each other in a different way. And I think we're all kind of like divide and rule. Yeah, we're all operating as individuals. We are. I think we shouldn't be in competition. We're all hoping to make the world a better place for our offspring and all those kids of ours who've worked so hard and don't see any, they do need role models. I earned my own money from the age of 9. I was the church organist. I wanted to do my grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, my exams on the piano, like my school friends, but we didn't have the money.
How do we get that into
the thing is
into the grassroots?
So let me give you an example. So and it's been interesting to hear Justin's view on this. So where I grew up, there was a very alpha male culture, like incredibly alpha male, and I try to be sensitive and have empathy, and I hope I do. Raising a house of a sister and a mother and no father figure, you can't help but be in touch with your feminine side. But at the same time, when you walk out the door, it's a very alpha male culture. What alpha male culture stops you from doing is having empathy and thinking about other people, because it is about you and how you're seen, how you're perceived, and any sign of vulnerability or weakness, which, what was a community based on? It's based on understanding, mutual respect, support. The culture that I grew up in was just the antithesis of that. And until we are able to And honestly, it's a self-defense mechanism. It's 100% self-defense mechanism. Most of the guys that I knew that were the tough guys were also the most vulnerable and the weakest. But what they did is they overinflated that side of their personalities to compensate for the fact that they were weak. And until we can start breaking that, and obviously, that's just the masculine side. The feminine side, there's another narrative. But it's just an example of until we can start breaking that cycle. We have a long way to go.
Yeah, Justin?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And that's actually really well articulated, that essentially as a kid, I had to put on a front, because if I showed weakness, then I'd be bullied and so on and so forth. So you had to do that. You had to do that in order to survive almost. Yeah. Just on role models, I do think it is important, because obviously role models, we know, inspire people, etc., etc. But I also think role models can break down barriers and biases and perceptions that people have of certain roles. So if people think, okay, fund manager, they've got something in their mind of what a fund manager looks like, but by having people who have broken through, all of a sudden those biases start to change. And you've probably heard this before, but one of the most upsetting things I've heard in the last year or so is somebody, not Elgin, is somebody who sits in the reporting team, at their organisation, is desperate to get to the investment floor, done a numerate degree, passionate about investing, invest their own money. And she said to me, look, even if a job became available, I would not put my CV in the hat, because when I go to my investment floor, nobody looks like me, nobody sounds like me. So why would I be accepted? So it's her biases, number one, but also the biases from the people who are doing the hiring, who she feels would be biased against her.
Yeah, and you hear that over and over again.
One of the things that ways in which we're addressing this sort of thing in my industry is having screened auditions. Where, because if it really does only matter what someone sounds like, then why should it matter what they look like? Yeah. And yet our orchestras, in England, I think our orchestras, we have something like 1.7% of ethnic BME in our orchestras, which is fairly unimpressive. Unimpressive. And even though the figure is only 1.8% in America, which shocks me, every single one of my colleagues of colour in the States have won their jobs without being seen.
Let's very quickly just look at the answer in a way. It would be great to think about what we would be saying to organisations who are saying, okay, we get it and we'd like to change. Yeah. What can we do?
Let's start with the big one, which is the fact this is still a taboo subject. We need to start discussing this. And, Justin, yourself, Chi-chi, we are all catalysts for change. And I think for this to get on the agenda, you need people like us to kind of carry the torch. I would urge your CEOs to just, if there's only the black people in your organisation doing this, then you still really haven't embraced it. So you need to industrialise in the same way that you've industrialised the gender debate. You need to industrialise this in your organisation, and don't just let it be the people of colour who are.
Do you think there's some learnings? Do you think there's some learnings from the gender project, if you like? I mean, that has been hugely successful, and rightly so. But what do you think we can learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And let's be honest. If it wasn't for women, then we probably wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation right now, right? So those guys they haven't just opened the door; they've kind of kicked it down and then saying, "Come on, LGBT community, people of colour, come on through." And I think what they've done is led by example. So they've put themselves in senior positions. I think that for a while they had to be quite insular about what they were doing, but now taking men on the journey, so much so that if I'm in a meeting and there isn't a female present, we're now asking.
It gets called out, right?
Right. It's normal. It's now normalised. Ironically, I won't say where's the other person. So but that's kind of where we need to. That's kind of where we need to get to.
Yeah.
And I think they're a great example of what a movement, Me Too, You know, what a movement can be. You know, and they will say they've still got a long way to go. Absolutely, let's not suggest that the female debate is done, but that's a starting point. And the other thing that I would say is that we kind of need some outside help with this. So we now understand that there's a consultation on the ethnicity pay gap. Excellent. That's exactly what you need, because that changes it from a narrative of 4 people into a problem that organisations, or not, but most likely a problem that organisations have to deal with.
Yeah. Chi-chi, you have the massive advantage of being not just black, but also a woman and very successful at
And
it.
5 foot tall.
I like the way you said advantage as well.
What learnings do you think we can take from the gender, the success that women have had in, as Gavin puts it, kicking the door down and just saying, we're here and you need to take notice and we need to be part of the discussion and part of what's happening?
Well, from what I'm hearing today, I mean, I think you're all already on those things. You're already on that path, and it's a question of just insisting to call the narrative, own the narrative, and include the whole, you know, female thing as well. And you know, it's had a massive effect. Just what I was talking about before, having screens. There's 25% more women in the industry. It's instantly changed things. I don't know how you do that, if you can do screens, but
you can with CVs. I mean, there's a whole bunch of
as
you
well
can
as the
definitely do a
screening
whole
thing.
bunch of stuff.
But then you still have to get to the last point when you walk through the door, because it's one thing getting the job. It's another thing, how does that person progress once they've got the job? How do they feel welcome and supported, and that they own their place, their industry?
Yeah. You know, I was talking to a lady yesterday. We were having a similar conversation, and she was saying that. So she's got a very English-sounding name, a bit like yours, Gavin Lewis. Well, it's obviously not Gavin Lewis, but it's an equivalent in an English-sounding name. And she was talking about having been through the entire job application process, only to turn up for the final interview. And as she gets there, the interviewer, the person she's meeting, realizes this person's black, and she just, you know, the smile just went from this person's face, and she didn't get the job. How do we change that, Justin? I mean, just any advice you would give?
So I think it's education and discussion. You see, a lot of people just don't understand or don't see those challenges because they've never had those challenges themselves. So one thing I'd say to CEOs is actually go and speak to the diverse people in your organisation and try and understand the challenges that they've been through. That's the first point. I think the second point is we need to stop using the data as an excuse, and that's why I really welcome the race at work charter, because actually it's talking about we just need to get the data. You know, full stop. Let's get the data on ethnicity. The US is miles ahead in gathering data on ethnicity. If you look at most organisations across the UK, it's all, you know, you've got to self-proclaim self-determine your ethnicity. And a lot of people don't fill it in, right? So actually, what we need to do is ensure that we do have data, because then you can start to see trends, right? You can see whether the people that have come in your organisation, whether they're progressing or not, and how they're getting on. At the moment, we can't even see that, right? We can't see that.
We can't just have a dialogue that, in the same way that women have taken men on the journey, and I think women need a gauge on the discussion and need men in the room to challenge as well. And I would like to have more people of not more white people in this conversation.
I completely agree with you, and this is why we have to take people with us. When the data, you probably saw the Ernst & Young report, right, which said that essentially 60% of white males, feel they're going to be overlooked for promotion. Unless we take those people with us, then the conversation's dead before it starts.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, look, that's been hugely powerful and enlightening. Thank you very much indeed, Gavin, Chi-chi, Justin. Thanks so much for joining us. This has been Talk About Black, and we've had a big discussion today. This is one of the hottest topics, one of the hardest topics in some senses, but I'm so delighted that we've had this conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.